Sometimes a man runs so far from his past that he forgets he's still carrying it with him. For 13 years, that's exactly what Clint Maynard had been doing in the Montana wilderness. He lived alone with his dog Boone, finding peace in the silence of towering pines and mountain streams. His old life felt like someone else's story, buried and forgotten where it belonged. Then one morning Boone started barking and ran toward the creek. Clint followed his faithful companion down the familiar path. What he found floating in the water changed everything. There was a body wrapped in an old cavalry jacket, the same kind Clint had worn years ago as a young soldier. Inside the coat pocket was a letter with his name on it, written in his own handwriting from decades past. How does a letter you wrote as a young man find its way back to you after all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the valley like an old man's breath on a cold day, rolling between the pines with the patience that only comes from understanding time. Clint Maynard stood at the edge of Willow Creek, his weathered hands trembling, not from the mountain chill, but from something deeper. Something that had been sleeping in his bones for longer than he cared to remember. Boone whimpered beside him, the golden retriever's usual enthusiasm replaced by an unusual stillness. The dog's brown eyes fixed on the floating figure as if he understood the gravity of what they'd discovered. In 13 years of mountain living, Boone had never led Clint astray. The dog had an instinct for danger, for weather changes, for the subtle shifts in the wilderness that kept them both alive. But this morning Boone had awakened with purpose, scratching at the cabin door before dawn, with an urgency that pulled Clint from his dreamless sleep. The cabin sat a quarter-mile uphill from the creek, nestled in a grove of lodgepole pines that had watched over this valley since before the first settlers crossed the Continental Divide. Clint had built it himself in those early days, when his hands still shook from more than mountain cold, when the nightmares came every night and the bottle was his only companion besides the dog. The structure was simple but solid, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew clean, a roof that had weathered 13 winters without complaint. Inside, the cabin told the story of a man who had learned to live with less. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and living space. The furniture was handmade from fallen timber, a sturdy table, 2 chairs, though he never had visitors, shelves that held his few books and supplies. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, its presence both practical and comforting on the long winter nights when the wind howled through the peaks like something searching for the lost. The walls bore no photographs, no reminders of the world he'd left behind. The only decoration was a faded map of the territory, marked with penciled trails and hunting spots he'd discovered over the years. Everything in the cabin had purpose. Nothing was ornamental. It was the home of a man who had stripped his life down to its essential elements. Clint's daily routine had become as predictable as the mountain seasons. Rise before dawn, check the weather, tend to Boone, survey the surrounding area for signs of wildlife or unwanted visitors. Breakfast was usually coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, and whatever provisions he had on hand. Jerky, hardtack, occasionally fresh trout from the creek when the fish were running. He spoke aloud during these morning rituals, mostly to Boone, sometimes to himself, keeping his voice from growing rusty with disuse. Another clear day. Boy, he would say, watching the dog's ears perk at the familiar cadence. Might be a good day for checking the snares up on the ridge. The snares were part of his survival system, providing rabbit and squirrel when his supplies ran low. He made monthly trips to the trading post in Cedar Falls, a 20-mile trek down the mountain that served as his only connection to civilization. Jed Morrison ran the post, a taciturn man in his 60s who understood the value of silence. Their transactions were brief, efficient, Clint trading pelts and hand-carved items for coffee, ammunition, and basic supplies. "You doing all right up there, Clint?" Jed would ask, the same question every month. "Doing fine," Clint would reply, the same answer every time. Neither man pressed for more. In the mountain country, a man's privacy was respected like sacred ground. Jed had known mountain hermits before, men who came to the high country carrying wounds that couldn't be seen, seeking the kind of healing that only silence and solitude could provide. He never asked questions about Clint's past, and Clint appreciated that more than the man probably knew. The isolation had been intentional at first, necessary. Clint remembered those early months when every unexpected sound sent him reaching for the rifle, when sleep came in fragments between nightmares filled with smoke and screaming. The army doctors had called it different things over the years: shell shock, battle fatigue, post-traumatic stress. The labels changed, but the weight remained constant. He'd tried returning to normal life after the discharge. There had been a brief attempt at settling in Denver, a job at a lumber yard, even a small apartment near the South Platte River. But the city pressed against him like a vice. The noise, the crowds, the constant reminders of a world that moved forward while his mind remained trapped in places he couldn't name to people who wouldn't understand. The drinking had started as medication, evolved into necessity, and finally became the thing that nearly destroyed what was left of him. He remembered fragments of those lost months, waking up in places he didn't recognize, faces of concerned strangers, the bitter taste of whiskey that had stopped providing escape and become another form of prison. The decision to leave civilization hadn't been dramatic. One morning he'd simply packed his few belongings, bought a used truck, and started driving west until the roads ran out. When he found this valley, something in his chest had loosened for the first time in years. The silence here wasn't empty. It was full of wind through pine needles, water over stones, the distant call of hawks riding thermals above the peaks. It was a silence that healed instead of haunted. Boone had arrived during the second winter, a half-starved puppy that wandered into camp during a blizzard. Clint had intended to feed the dog and send him on his way, but the little golden retriever had other plans. He'd curled up by the fire and appointed himself Clint's permanent companion. The dog filled a need Clint hadn't realized existed, something to care for, something that depended on him without asking questions about his past. "We make a good team, don't we, boy?" Clint would say during their evening walks, and Boone would wag his entire body in agreement. The years had passed quietly, marked by the changing seasons and the gradual healing that comes from consistent routine and purposeful work. Clint had learned to read the weather by cloud formations, to track wildlife by signs invisible to untrained eyes, to find peace in the simple act of splitting wood or mending tools. His hands, once trained for violence, learned gentler skills: carving, fishing, the delicate work of setting snares without causing unnecessary suffering. The nightmares came less frequently. Months would pass without dreams of burning villages or the faces of men he'd killed in the name of duty. The tremors in his hands, once constant reminders of battles fought in jungles half a world away, had faded to occasional shivers when the weather changed. He was healing, slowly but surely, in the way that broken bones mend when given time and proper care. But standing at the creek's edge, staring at the impossible sight of that cavalry jacket, Clint felt the familiar tightness returning to his chest. The past, it seemed, wasn't content to stay buried. It had found him despite his careful isolation, despite 13 years of deliberate forgetting. The body in the water was small, the size of a young man. Barely more than a boy, really. The cavalry jacket was Union blue, faded but unmistakable in its military precision. Brass buttons caught the morning light like distant stars. The fabric showed no signs of decay despite being in the water, as if time itself had preserved this moment for his discovery. Clint's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He knew that jacket pattern, had worn one just like it during his service, but that was decades ago, during conflicts that belonged to history books, not to floating bodies in remote mountain creeks. The preservation was impossible. Cloth and leather should have rotted away long ago, yet this jacket looked as fresh as the day it was issued. The letter in the breast pocket was equally impossible. His name was written in his own hand, but it was the handwriting of a young man, firm, Confident strokes that belonged to someone who hadn't yet learned that the world could break a person's faith in simple certainties. The wax seal that had protected it was unbroken, bearing an insignia he recognized but couldn't immediately place. Boone moved closer to the water's edge, his nose working to catch scents that might explain this mystery. The dog's behavior was strange, alert but not alarmed, as if he recognized something familiar in this impossible scene. Clint trusted Boone's instincts more than his own rational mind, and the dog's calm demeanor suggested that whatever they'd found, it wasn't a threat. "What do you think, boy?" Clint whispered, his voice carrying easily in the morning stillness. "You brought me here for a reason." The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the last of the mist and revealing the creek in sharp detail. The water ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from the peaks above. Fish moved in the deeper pools, cutthroat trout that had never seen a hook, their movements lazy and confident. Everything about the scene was peaceful, except for the floating figure that shouldn't exist. Clint knew he would have to retrieve the body, examine it properly, try to understand what force had brought this impossible thing to his doorstep. But for now, he stood in the gathering warmth of the morning sun, feeling the weight of 13 years' carefully constructed solitude beginning to shift and crack like ice in a spring thaw. Clint waded into the creek, the mountain water shocking his legs, even through his heavy boots. The current was stronger than it appeared from the bank, tugging at his ankles with persistent fingers that spoke of snowmelt and distant glaciers. Boone whined from the shore, pacing back and forth but refusing to follow his master into the water. "Easy, boy," Clint murmured, keeping his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "We need to bring him home." The body was lighter than expected, as if the years in the water had somehow made it less substantial rather than more waterlogged. Clint lifted it carefully, respectfully, the way he'd learned to handle the dead in places where death came suddenly and without ceremony. The cavalry jacket was indeed pristine, its brass buttons bright as new pennies, the wool fabric showing no signs of rot or damage. Back on the bank, Clint laid the body on a patch of grass where the morning sun filtered through the pine canopy. The face was that of a young man, maybe 20 years old, with features that seemed vaguely familiar in a way that made Clint's chest tighten. The preservation was perfect, no decay, no bloating, as if the water had held this soldier in suspension rather than claimed him. With trembling fingers, Clint reached for the letter in the breast pocket. The wax seal bore the insignia of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, a unit he knew from military history but had never served with himself. His own service had been in a different war, a different time, fighting in jungles instead of on western plains. Yet his name was written on this envelope in handwriting he recognized as his own. The seal broke with a soft crack that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink as fresh as if it had been written yesterday. Clint unfolded it with hands that had steadied enough to perform surgery in combat zones, but now shook like autumn leaves. The letter was indeed in his handwriting, but not any version of his handwriting he remembered creating. "Clint, if you're reading this, then you've found what you need to find. The boy in the jacket is Thomas Whitmore, age 19, of the 7th Cavalry. He died at Little Bighorn in 1876, but that's not the end of his story. It's the beginning of yours. You've been running from more than just war, haven't you? Running from the knowledge that some debts can't be paid with blood, some wounds can't be healed with whiskey, some truths can't be buried no matter how deep you dig. Thomas has been waiting for you, not in death, but in the space between what was and what needs to be. You'll understand soon enough. The creek knows, the mountains remember, and somewhere in the high country there's a place where time bends back on itself like a river finding its source. Look for the stone circle 3 miles upstream. Follow the old hunting trail that branches north at the lightning-struck pine. When you find what's waiting there, you'll know why you came to this valley. You'll know why you never really left the war. Trust Boone. Dogs see things we've forgotten how to see. Yourself. From a time that hasn't happened yet, Clint read the letter 3 times. each reading making less sense than the last. The handwriting was undeniably his. He recognized the way he formed his letters, the slight leftward slant he'd developed after a shrapnel wound to his right shoulder. But the content belonged to someone who knew things about him that he'd never told another living soul. The mention of Little Bighorn sent ice through his veins. Every military man knew that name, knew the story of Custer's last stand in 1876. But that was over a century ago, ancient history that had nothing to do with his own service in Vietnam. How could a soldier from that battle be floating in a Montana creek in perfect preservation? How could a letter in his own handwriting reference events he'd never witnessed? "Trust Boone," he read aloud, looking at his faithful companion. The golden retriever sat at attention, those intelligent brown eyes fixed on something beyond the trees. "What do you see, boy? What brought you down here this morning?" As if in answer, Boone stood and walked to the edge of the clearing, nose pointed upstream toward the high country. His posture was alert but not anxious, like a hunting dog that had caught a familiar scent. The dog looked back at Clint with an expression that seemed almost human in its urgency. Clint folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket. The body of Thomas Whitmore lay peaceful in the dappled sunlight, the young face serene in a way that suggested final rest rather than violent death. Whatever had happened at Little Bighorn, whatever force had brought this soldier to Clint's Creek, it felt more like a gift than a curse. "We'll need to bury you proper," Clint said to the still form. "But first, I reckon we need to understand what you're trying to tell me." The mention of a stone circle upstream tugged at his memory. In 13 years of exploring these mountains, he'd found many interesting formations: ancient hunting blinds, old mining claims, rock cairns left by long-dead trappers. But a stone circle 3 miles up from his cabin would be in territory he'd never fully explored. High country, where the game trails became treacherous and the weather could turn deadly without warning. The lightning-struck pine was easier to place. He'd seen it during one of his early explorations, a massive ponderosa that had been split down the middle by some long-ago storm. It stood like a monument to nature's power, its blackened trunk visible from miles away. If there was indeed a hunting trail that branched north from that landmark, it was older than any path he'd discovered in his wanderings. Clint looked at the young soldier one more time, studying the peaceful features. There was something familiar about the face, something that nagged at the edge of recognition. The bone structure, the set of the jaw, even the way the hair fell across the forehead, it all seemed like an echo of someone he'd known. But that was impossible. This boy had died in 1876, more than a century before Clint was born. "Come on, boy," he said to Boone, who was still pointing upstream like a compass needle seeking true north. "Let's get Thomas back to the cabin. Then we'll see about this stone circle." The walk back to the cabin was accomplished in thoughtful silence. Clint carried the body easily, surprised again by how light it felt. Boone ranged ahead, checking the familiar path for any changes since their morning departure. The routine was comforting, a reminder that some things remained constant even when the world tilted sideways. At the cabin, Clint laid Thomas Whitmore on the wooden table he'd built for preparing game. The cavalry jacket looked even more pristine in the indoor light, the brass buttons gleaming like they'd just been polished. Clint examined the uniform more closely, noting details he'd missed by the creek. The jacket bore the insignia of a private, but the craftsmanship was exceptional. Hand-stitched buttonholes, perfectly aligned seams, brass fittings that showed no signs of tarnish. It was the kind of uniform worn by a soldier who took pride in his appearance, who understood that military bearing was about more than following orders. More importantly, tucked inside the jacket's inner pocket was something else, a small leather journal also perfectly preserved. Clint opened it carefully, finding pages covered with neat entries in pencil. The dates began in the spring of 1876 and continued right up to June 25th, the day of the Battle of Little Bighorn. The final entry was brief but haunting. "Tomorrow, we ride with Custer. The scouts say there are more Sioux than we expected, but the colonel is confident. I dreamed last night of a cabin in the mountains, a place where time moves differently. If I don't make it home, maybe I'll find my way there instead." Clint closed the journal and sat heavily in one of his handmade chairs. The pieces of this impossible puzzle were falling into place in ways that defied rational explanation. A soldier from 1876 dreams of a mountain cabin. That same soldier dies at Little Bighorn, but somehow ends up perfectly preserved in a creek behind that very cabin. A letter written in Clint's own hand references events and knowledge that should be impossible. Outside, Boone began barking, not the excited yip of a dog who'd spotted a squirrel, but the deep, purposeful bark that meant something significant was approaching. Clint moved to the window and peered through the glass toward the tree line. 3 figures were walking up the path from the creek, moving with the measured pace of people who belonged in this landscape. As they drew closer, Clint could make out details that made his blood run cold. They wore cavalry uniforms, but these weren't preserved like Thomas Whitmore's perfect jacket. These uniforms showed the damage of battle, tears, stains, bullet holes that spoke of violent ends. The men themselves looked solid enough, casting shadows and leaving footprints in the soft earth. But there was something translucent about them, as if they existed in the space between substance and memory. They walked with purpose toward his cabin, and Clint knew without doubt that they'd come for Thomas Whitmore. The time for rational explanations was over. Whatever was happening in this valley, whatever force had brought the past colliding into his carefully ordered present, it was just beginning. Clint's hand moved instinctively to the rifle, hanging above the fireplace, then stopped. Whatever was walking up his path, whatever purpose these figures served, violence wouldn't solve this mystery. He'd learned that lesson in jungles, where ghosts of a different kind had haunted his dreams. Sometimes the only way forward was to face what you'd been running from. Boone's barking softened to a low whine as the 3 figures approached the cabin. The dog's tail wasn't wagging, but neither was his hackles raised. It was the cautious alertness of an animal, encountering something beyond normal experience, but not necessarily threatening. The knock on his door came soft, but firm, 3 measured raps that spoke of military discipline. Clint walked slowly across the room, his bare feet silent on the wooden planks he'd laid himself. Through the window he could see them clearly now. 3 cavalry soldiers in various states of ethereal existence, their uniforms bearing the same 7th Cavalry insignia as Thomas Whitmore's jacket. The man in front was older, maybe 30, with sergeant's stripes on his sleeves and a face that had seen too much even before death found him. His uniform showed a massive stain across the chest where blood had once flowed, now faded to brown shadows on the blue wool. Behind him stood 2 younger soldiers, privates by their insignia, both bearing wounds that told stories of a battle's final moments. Clint opened the door. "Mr. Maynard," the sergeant said, his voice carrying the solid authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We've come for Private Whitmore." "I figured as much," Clint replied, stepping aside to let them enter. "Coffee." The offer seemed to surprise them. The sergeant paused, glancing at his companions before nodding slowly. "That's kind of you. It's been a long time since anyone offered. Inside the cabin, the 3 spirits, for that's what they had to be, impossible as it seemed, arranged themselves around Clint's small table where Thomas Whitmore's body lay in peaceful repose. They moved with purpose, but also with reverence. Like honor guard come to collect a fallen comrade. Clint poured coffee into his 3 extra tin cups. The ones he'd kept out of habit, though he'd never had occasion to use them. The liquid steamed in the mountain air, and he was surprised to see the spirits actually lift the cups to their lips and drink. "Sergeant Marcus Webb," the older soldier introduced himself. "These are Privates Collins and Murphy. We served with Thomas at Little Bighorn." He paused, studying Clint's face. "You look like him, you know. Around the eyes especially." "Like who?" Clint asked, though something in his chest already knew the answer. "Like Thomas. Like you could be family." Webb set down his cup and pulled out a small item wrapped in oilcloth. "This belongs to you now. Inside the wrapping was a compass, brass and silver, with intricate engravings around the face. The needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a direction that wasn't quite north, pointing instead toward the high country where the letter had mentioned a stone circle. "That's a spirit compass," Webb explained, "made by a Lakota medicine man who understood that some directions can't be found on any map. It points toward unfinished business, toward places where time has gotten tangled up in itself." Clint turned the compass over in his hands. The back was engraved with initials, TW to CM, until all debts are paid. The craftsmanship was exquisite, far finer than anything a common soldier could have afforded. "Thomas made it for you." Private Collins spoke for the first time, his young voice carrying an Irish accent. "Worked on it for months before we rode out. Said he had a feeling he'd need to send someone a message someday. But I never knew him," Clint protested. "I wasn't even born until—" "Time isn't a straight line up here," Murphy interrupted, his words carrying the soft drawl of the South. "Not in these mountains. The Lakota knew that. The old trappers learned it. And soldiers like us, well, we found out the hard way." Webb stood and walked to the window, gazing up toward the peaks. "There's a debt that needs settling, Mr. Maynard, something that's been waiting more than a century to be made right. Thomas volunteered to carry the message because he said he understood about carrying burdens you never asked for." "What kind of debt?" Clint asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would involve his own past, his own carefully buried guilt. "The kind that gets passed down through blood and time," Webb replied. "The kind that follows you even when you think you've run far enough to escape it." He turned back to face Clint, and in the sergeant's eyes was a weariness that went beyond death, beyond the simple exhaustion of battle. "Your great-great-grandfather was at Little Bighorn, Mr. Maynard. Corporal Charlie Maynard, 7th Cavalry, killed in the first charge along with most of his company. But before he died, he made a promise to Thomas Whitmore that never got kept." The name hit Clint like a physical blow. Charlie Maynard. He'd heard stories about a Civil War ancestor, fragments of family history that had been lost over the generations. His grandmother had mentioned a soldier in the family, someone who'd gone west after the war and never came home. What promise? Clint's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. Webb reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, faded and cracked, but still visible. It showed two young soldiers standing beside a tent, arms around each other's shoulders, in the easy camaraderie of shared hardship. One was clearly Thomas Whitmore. The other had Clint's eyes, his jawline, his general build. Charlie promised to look after Thomas's sister if anything happened to him, Webb explained. "Girl named Sarah living in a settlement near Fort Lincoln. But Charlie died 20 minutes after Thomas in the same charge. The promise never got kept. Sarah waited for word that never came, died alone and forgotten while the newspapers wrote about Custer's glory." Private Collins leaned forward. "That's the debt, sir. A promise made by a dying man to another dying man, witnessed by those of us who lived long enough to see them both fall. Some debts follow bloodlines, get passed down until someone with the strength to carry them comes along." Clint stared at the photograph, seeing his own features reflected in a face from more than a century past. The resemblance was unmistakable, not just family similarity, but something deeper, as if the same soul had worn different faces across different times. "Why me?" he asked. "Why now?" "Because you're the first Maynard in 4 generations who understands what it means to carry the weight of things left undone," Webb replied. "Thomas has been waiting for someone who could make this right, someone who knows what it's like to survive when better men didn't." Murphy stood and walked to where Thomas's body lay peaceful on the table. "He's been holding this burden for all of us, sir, carrying the weight of that unfulfilled promise. It's time to let him rest." "But Sarah's been dead for over a century," Clint protested. "How do I keep a promise to someone who—" "The stone circle," Webb interrupted. "That's where time bends back on itself. That's where you can reach across the years and make things right. The Lakota called it a thin place, where the spirits of the past can touch the present. Boone had been sitting quietly throughout this impossible conversation, but now he stood and walked to the door, looking back at Clint with unmistakable purpose. The dog understood something that rational thought couldn't grasp. "He's been waiting for you too," Webb observed, watching Boone's behavior. "Animals know these things better than we do. They can sense when the natural order needs mending." Clint looked at the compass in his hands, its needle pointing steadily toward the high country. The brass felt warm against his palms, as if it carried some inner fire that had been burning for more than 100 years. "What happens if I can't do it?" he asked. "What happens if I can't make this right?" The three spirits exchanged glances, and for a moment their translucent forms seemed to solidify, becoming more real, more present. "Then Thomas stays caught between worlds forever," Webb said quietly. "And the next time guilt comes looking for a Maynard to settle with, it might not be so patient." The three spirits departed as quietly as they'd arrived, carrying Thomas Whitmore's body between them like a honor guard escort. Clint watched from his doorway as they moved down the path toward the creek, their forms growing more translucent with each step until they faded entirely into the morning mist. Only the spirit compass remained, its needle still pointing steadily toward the high country. Boone pressed against Clint's leg, offering the comfort that only a faithful dog could provide. The golden retriever's presence was solid and warm, a reminder that some things in this world remained constant even when the impossible became routine. "Well, boy," Clint said, scratching behind Boone's ears, "looks like our quiet life just got complicated." He spent the rest of the morning preparing for the journey upstream. 13 years of mountain living had taught him to respect the high country's sudden weather changes and treacherous terrain. He packed his military-issue backpack with supplies, jerky, hardtack, coffee, matches sealed in wax, a first aid kit, extra ammunition for the rifle. The 30-06 had been his grandfather's hunting rifle, reliable and accurate, though he hoped he wouldn't need it for anything more threatening than warning shots. The spirit compass went into his shirt pocket alongside the impossible letter. Both items felt warm against his chest, as if they carried some residual energy from their supernatural origins. Every few minutes he found himself checking the compass, watching its needle swing toward the high peaks with unwavering certainty. By midday he was ready to travel. The walk to the lightning-struck pine would take most of the afternoon, following game trails he knew well until they reached territory he'd never fully explored. Boone seemed eager to begin, ranging ahead with the purposeful energy of a dog who understood they had important business in the mountains. The first part of the journey followed familiar paths. Clint had walked these trails countless times over the years, checking snares, hunting game, simply enjoying the peace that came from moving through wilderness without destination or deadline. The rhythm of walking was meditative, boot leather on stone and pine needles, the steady cadence of breathing that matched his stride. The occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Boone trotted ahead, nose working constantly to read the stories, written in scent and sign. The dog paused occasionally to investigate interesting smells or to mark territory, but always returned to the trail with the purposeful gait of an animal on a mission. His behavior was different today, more focused, less playful, as if he understood the gravity of their quest. The mountains around them rose like cathedral spires, their peaks crowned with snow that never fully melted even in the warmest summers. Pine and fir covered the lower slopes in dark green waves that rolled up toward the tree line. Above that, bare stone and alpine meadows stretched toward skies so blue they seemed painted. This was country that demanded respect, beautiful but unforgiving, peaceful but potentially deadly for the unprepared. As they climbed higher, Clint found himself thinking about Charlie Maynard, the great-great-grandfather he'd never known. Family stories had been sparse, something about a soldier who'd gone west after the Civil War, who'd written letters for a while and then disappeared into silence. Clint's grandmother had kept a few items in an old trunk, a faded daguerreotype, some letters written in careful script, a medal from some forgotten campaign. The resemblance in the photograph Webb had shown him was undeniable. Not just the physical features, but something in the posture, the way Charlie had held himself. It was the bearing of a man who'd seen too much but kept moving forward anyway. Clint recognized that stance. He'd seen it in mirrors during his own darkest years. What kind of man had Charlie been? What had driven him to the frontier after surviving one war, only to die in another? The questions multiplied as Clint walked, creating a mental portrait of an ancestor he was only now beginning to understand. Charlie had been a survivor like himself. Charlie had carried burdens like himself. And Charlie had made a promise that his death had prevented him from keeping. The weight of inherited responsibility settled across Clint's shoulders like a familiar pack. He'd spent 13 years trying to escape the obligations of his past, the duties and debts that had accumulated during his military service. Now it seemed the past had found another way to claim him, reaching across more than a century to demand payment on a promise he'd never made. But wasn't that always the way with family? The sins and debts of one generation became the burden of the next, passed down like genetic inheritance until someone finally found the strength or courage to break the cycle. Clint had thought his isolation in the mountains was an escape from that pattern. Instead, it might have been preparation for it. The lightning-struck pine came into view as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The massive ponderosa stood like a monument to nature's raw power, its trunk split cleanly down the middle by some long-ago storm. One half had died and weathered to silver bone, while the other half continued to grow. Green needles reaching toward the sky in defiant celebration of survival. Boone barked once and turned north, following a path that was barely visible among the fallen timber and undergrowth. The spirit compass confirmed the direction, its needle swinging to align with Boone's choice. This was the hunting trail mentioned in the letter, older than any path Clint had discovered in his years of exploration. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding between massive boulders and fallen logs that spoke of avalanches and storms from decades past. The footing was uncertain, requiring careful attention to each step. This wasn't country for casual hikers. It demanded respect and experience from anyone foolish enough to venture into its embrace. As they climbed higher, the air grew thinner and colder. They were approaching the altitude where trees gave way to alpine meadows, where the weather could change from sunshine to deadly storm in minutes. Clint checked his watch and calculated the remaining daylight. They had perhaps 3 hours before sunset, enough time to reach the stone circle if it wasn't too much farther ahead. The trail crested a ridge and opened into a high valley Clint had never seen before. It was a hidden pocket of the mountains, sheltered from wind and weather by surrounding peaks. A small lake reflected the sky like polished silver, fed by streams that cascaded down from glaciers above. Alpine flowers dotted the meadows in splashes of purple and gold. Their brief growing season concentrated into intense displays of beauty. And there, on a rise above the lake, stood the stone circle. It was smaller than Clint had expected, but somehow more impressive. Perhaps a dozen standing stones arranged in a perfect circle, each one taller than a man and carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the afternoon light. The stones were clearly ancient, weathered by centuries of mountain storms, yet they radiated a sense of purpose that spoke of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Boone approached the circle cautiously, his usual exuberance replaced by respectful alertness. He circled the stones once, sniffing carefully at each one, before sitting at what appeared to be the entrance, a gap between two larger stones that faced east toward the rising sun. The spirit compass in Clint's pocket grew warm, then hot, its needles spinning wildly before settling on the center of the stone circle. Whatever force had guided them here, whatever power had preserved Thomas Whitmore across more than a century, it was strongest at this place where ancient stones held vigil over a hidden valley. Clint approached slowly, feeling the weight of history and obligation settling around him like mountain mist. Somewhere in this circle of stones, time bent back on itself, Somewhere here, a promise made at Little Bighorn could finally be kept. As Clint stepped between the standing stones, the world shifted in ways that had nothing to do with physical movement. The air grew thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and sounds became muffled as if he were moving underwater. Boone whimpered softly, but followed, his loyalty overcoming whatever instinctive warnings his animal senses were providing. The stones themselves were carved with symbols that seemed to move in peripheral vision, spirals, and lines that suggested meaning without quite revealing it. Some were clearly Native American in origin, the work of hands that understood the sacred geometry of this place. Others appeared older, more primitive, as if different cultures had found this circle across centuries and added their own understanding to its power. In the center of the circle lay a flat stone altar, its surface worn smooth by weather and time. Dark stains marked its edges, not blood, but something that had soaked into the stone itself, leaving permanent shadows that spoke of ancient rituals and offerings. The spirit compass in Clint's pocket was almost too hot to touch now, its needle spinning frantically, as if unable to choose between multiple directions in this place where normal rules didn't apply. Clint approached the altar carefully, feeling the weight of ages pressing down on him. The late afternoon sun slanted through the standing stones, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift independently of the moving clouds above. This was a place that existed at the intersection of past and present, where time pooled like water in a mountain basin. He pulled out the letter and compass, setting them on the altar's smooth surface. The moment they touched the stone, the air around the circle began to shimmer like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The shimmering intensified, forming shapes that weren't quite solid but weren't quite illusion either. A woman materialized first, young, perhaps 20, with dark hair pinned back in the style of the 1870s. She wore a simple dress that had seen better days, faded calico that spoke of frontier hardship rather than fashion. Her face bore the weathered look of someone who'd worked in sun and wind, but her eyes held intelligence and determination that no amount of hardship could diminish. "Sarah Whitmore," Clint whispered, recognizing her from some indefinable quality that connected her to her brother Thomas. She nodded, her form becoming more solid as the circle's power strengthened. "Mr. Maynard, Charlie's blood, I can see it in your face. I've been waiting so long for someone to come." Around her, other figures began to take shape, men, women, and children in the clothing of different eras. Some wore frontier garb like Sarah's, others the uniforms of various military campaigns, still others the simple working clothes of farmers and laborers. All bore the same translucent quality that marked them as spirits, souls caught between worlds by unfinished business. "These are the others," Sarah explained, gesturing to the growing crowd. "People who died with promises left unfulfilled, debts unpaid, words unspoken. This place holds us until someone with the power to act can make things right." An older man stepped forward, wearing the blue uniform of a Union officer. His face was kind but tired, bearing the weight of decisions that had sent younger men to their deaths. "Colonel Matthew Brennan, 3rd Infantry," he introduced himself. "I promised my son I'd return from Gettysburg. Been waiting here for someone who understands the cost of broken promises to soldiers' families." A young woman in a nurse's uniform from a more recent war followed. "Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, Army Nurse Corps, Vietnam. I promised a dying boy I'd write to his mother, tell her he was brave at the end. Never got the chance. Incoming artillery took out our field hospital the next morning. One by one, they shared their stories. A cavalry trooper who'd promised to marry his sweetheart after the Indian Wars ended. A doughboy from the Great War who'd sworn to his dying friend that he'd visit the man's parents in Iowa. A World War II pilot who'd vowed to deliver a final letter to his navigator's wife. Generation after generation of soldiers and civilians, all bound by the same thread, promises made in desperate moments. Promises that death had prevented them from keeping. "The circle holds us," Sarah explained, "but it also empowers us. Here where time bends, one person acting with pure intention can fulfill the obligations of many. Charlie promised to look after me, but his promise became part of something larger. A web of unfulfilled duties that spans more than a century. Clint felt the weight of their collective need pressing against him like a physical force. I'm just one man. How can I possibly— Not just any man, Sarah interrupted. A man who understands guilt, who knows what it means to survive when others didn't. A man who's been running from his own unfulfilled promises for 13 years. The words hit like a physical blow. Clint's mind flashed to faces from his own war. Rodriguez, who'd asked him to tell his wife he loved her. Thompson, who'd wanted his parents to know he died without fear. Williams, who'd made Clint promise to visit his young son and explain why Daddy never came home. Promises Clint had intended to keep, but never quite found the courage to fulfill. You see, Sarah's voice was gentle but insistent. You carry the same burden we all do. The difference is you're still alive. You still have the power to act. A new artifact materialized on the altar, a small leather book bound with cord, its pages filled with names and addresses written in different hands. The Book of Promises, Sarah explained. Every unfulfilled obligation, every debt of honor left unpaid. Your name is in there too, Mr. Maynard. Your own promises waiting to be kept. Clint picked up the book with trembling hands. The leather was warm, as if it had been resting in sunlight, and the pages fell open to familiar names written in his own handwriting. The soldiers from his unit who'd asked him to carry final messages home. Addresses he'd memorized but never visited. Words he'd sworn to deliver but had buried instead beneath whiskey and isolation. The circle's power works both ways, Sarah continued. Help us fulfill our promises, and it will give you the strength to fulfill your own. Time bends here, Mr. Maynard. Distance becomes meaningless. One visit to one family can reach across decades to comfort another. Boone had been sitting quietly throughout this supernatural conference, but now he stood and walked to Clint's side. The dog's presence was grounding, a reminder of loyalty that transcended human complications. Boone had never made promises he couldn't keep, never carried guilt over words left unspoken. His devotion was simple and complete. How does it work? Clint asked, though part of him already understood. The circle wasn't just a place, it was a doorway, a focal point where intention could reshape reality. Act with pure purpose here, and the effects would ripple outward through time and space. Choose one promise to begin with, Sarah advised. Speak it aloud in the circle's center. Let the power here guide you to the right person at the right time. Trust that the message will reach its destination, regardless of how many years have passed. The assembled spirits watched expectantly as Clint opened the Book of Promises to the first page. There, in his own handwriting, was Rodriguez's wife's name and the address of a small house in San Antonio, Texas. Below it, the words he'd promised to deliver. Tell Maria I loved her more than life itself. Tell her the last thing I saw was her face. And it made dying easy. Clint had never understood how those simple words could possibly comfort a widow. But standing in the circle, surrounded by generations of unfulfilled obligations, he began to see the larger pattern. Love transcended death, but only if it was allowed to complete its journey. Messages needed to reach their destinations. Promises needed to be kept. Rodriguez first, he said aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the charged air of the circle. Maria Rodriguez in San Antonio. She needs to know her husband died thinking of her love. The moment he spoke the words, the circle erupted in light. The light from the stone circle wasn't blinding. It was more like being wrapped in warm sunlight, as if the afternoon had concentrated itself into pure radiance. Clint felt his feet leave the ground, not in any dramatic fashion, but simply as if gravity had become optional. Boone rose with him, the dog's calm acceptance of the impossible serving as an anchor for Clint's sanity. Around them, the mountain valley began to fade, replaced by something that wasn't quite vision and wasn't quite transportation. Colors blurred and shifted, showing glimpses of different places, different times. Clint saw flashes of battles he'd fought, cities he'd never visited, faces both familiar and strange. The circle was showing him the connections between all promises, all debts of honor that bound human hearts across time and distance. When the light faded, they stood on a quiet street in San Antonio, Texas. The sun was setting over modest houses with small front yards, and the air carried the scent of mesquite barbecue and evening jasmine. Children played in the distance, their laughter echoing off concrete and brick. This was clearly a working-class neighborhood, where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other's families. The house they stood before was small but well-maintained, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim around the windows. A garden in the front yard showed the careful attention of someone who found peace in growing things. Wind chimes on the porch tinkled softly in the evening breeze, and light glowed warmly through curtained windows. Clint checked the address against the one written in the Book of Promises. This was the place. But how many years had passed since Rodriguez died? How could he possibly find Maria after all this time? The questions multiplied in his mind until Boone nudged his leg and pointed with his nose toward the front porch. An older woman sat in a rocking chair, her hair silver in the porch light, her hands busy with some kind of needlework. She looked up as they approached, and Clint saw something in her face that made his breath catch. The bone structure, the set of her eyes. This was definitely Rodriguez's wife, aged by decades but unmistakably the woman whose photograph Rodriguez had carried in his wallet. Mrs. Rodriguez? Clint called softly, not wanting to startle her. She set down her needlework and studied him carefully. "Si, I am Maria Rodriguez." "Do I know you, senor?" "You look familiar somehow." Clint climbed the front steps slowly, Boone following close behind. The dog's presence seemed to put Maria at ease. She extended her hand for him to sniff, then scratched behind his ears when he approved of her. "Mrs. Rodriguez, my name is Clint Maynard. I served with your husband Eduardo in Vietnam. I promised him I would bring you a message." Maria's face went very still. She was quiet for a long moment, studying Clint's features in the porch light. "Eduardo died in 1971, she said finally. "That was more than 50 years ago, senor. You would have been just a boy then." "Time moves differently in some places," Clint replied, not even trying to explain the impossibility of what had happened. "Your husband asked me to tell you something important. He made me promise." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded for him to continue. "He said to tell you that he loved you more than life itself, that the last thing he saw was your face, and it made dying easy." The words hung in the evening air like a blessing. Maria covered her mouth with both hands, tears flowing freely now. She rocked back and forth in her chair, and for a moment Clint thought he'd made a terrible mistake, that bringing up old grief was cruel rather than kind. But when she looked up at him, her face was radiant with something deeper than sorrow. 53 years I have wondered," she whispered. 53 years I have asked the Virgin Mary to tell me if Eduardo suffered, if he was afraid, if he remembered our love at the end. The army, they told me nothing, just that he died in combat, that he was a hero. But I needed to know if he thought of me." She stood and walked to Clint, taking his hands in hers. Her grip was strong despite her age, the hands of a woman who had worked hard and endured much. "How is this possible, senor? How do you bring me this message after so many years?" "Some promises transcend time," Clint replied, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "Love doesn't die just because the body does. Eduardo's love for you has been waiting all these years to complete its journey." Maria nodded, as if this made perfect sense to her. "My Eduardo, he always kept his promises, always. I should have known he would find a way to keep this one too." She invited them inside for coffee, and Clint found himself in a living room that was a shrine to a love that had survived decades of separation. Photographs of Eduardo covered the mantel and side tables, young and handsome in his army uniform, laughing with friends, serious and proud on their wedding day. But there were other photos too. Grandchildren Eduardo had never met, family celebrations he'd missed, a life that had continued in his absence but never forgotten his presence. "I never remarried," Maria said, pouring coffee with the careful ritual of someone who had practiced hospitality for decades. "People said I should, that Eduardo would want me to be happy. But how could I explain that I was happy, that knowing he loved me was enough to fill all the empty years? She brought out a box of letters, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. These are all the letters he wrote me from Vietnam. I read them every Sunday after Mass. In the last one, he said he had something important to tell me when he came home, something he couldn't write in a letter. What do you think he wanted to say? Clint asked. Maria smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face into something beautiful. I think he wanted to tell me that love is stronger than death, that some promises can't be broken by bullets or time or distance. And now, through you, he has. As they talked, Clint began to understand the true power of what had happened in the stone circle. This wasn't just about delivering a message from a dead soldier to his widow. It was about completing a circuit of love that had been broken for more than half a century. Maria's faith that Eduardo would somehow reach her had been rewarded. Eduardo's desperate need to comfort her had finally been fulfilled. But more than that, something in Clint's own heart was healing. The guilt he'd carried for 50 years, not just about undelivered messages, but about surviving when better men hadn't, began to loosen its grip. Rodriguez hadn't died for nothing, if his love could still bring peace to the woman who'd waited for him. The war hadn't been meaningless, if its survivors could complete the missions the dead had left unfinished. When it came time to leave, Maria walked them to the front porch. The night was warm and filled with the sounds of a neighborhood settling into evening routines. Children were being called inside, porch lights were coming on, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. "Will I see you again, Senor Maynard?" Maria asked. "I don't know," Clint replied honestly. "But I think Eduardo will always be with you now, in a way he wasn't before." "The message has been delivered. The promise has been kept," Maria hugged him. And in that embrace, Clint felt the gratitude of generations, not just from her, but from Eduardo, from Rodriguez's ghost, from all the spirits who had been waiting for someone to bridge the gap between intention and completion. As they walked back down the quiet street, Boone trotting contentedly beside him, Clint felt the stone circle calling him home. One promise had been kept, but the book of promises contained dozens more. The work was just beginning, but for the first time in decades, it felt like work worth doing. The return to the stone circle happened as smoothly as the departure. One moment, they were walking down a San Antonio street. The next, they stood again among the ancient stones as the Montana sun set behind the western peaks. But something had changed in the circle during their absence. The spirits who had gathered before were still there, but they seemed more solid now, more present, as if Clint's successful completion of the first promise had strengthened their connection to the physical world. Sarah Whitmore approached with a smile that lit up her translucent features. "You did well, Mr. Maynard. I could feel it when the promise was fulfilled, like a weight lifting from all of us. Eduardo Rodriguez is at peace now." "One down," Clint said, opening the book of promises to reveal dozens of other names and addresses. "But how many more can I possibly—" He stopped speaking as his eyes found a name that made his blood run cold. There, written in handwriting he didn't recognize, was an entry that shouldn't exist. Clint Maynard, promise made to himself, February 15th, 1972, to return home and make peace with Martha Maynard before it's too late. Martha, his sister's name, hit him like a physical blow. He'd deliberately avoided thinking about her for 13 years, burying the memory of their last conversation beneath layers of guilt and whiskey. Martha had begged him to come home after his discharge, to get help for what the war had done to him. But he'd been too proud, too angry, too convinced that his family couldn't understand what he'd seen and done. "I never wrote this," he said, holding up the book. "This isn't my handwriting." Colonel Brennan stepped forward, his weathered face grave. "The Book of Promises doesn't only record what people write down, son. It records what they carry in their hearts, even when they're too broken to admit it to themselves." "Martha died 3 years ago," Clint whispered. "I found out at the trading post. Jed Morrison gets newspapers from back east sometimes. Cancer. She was only 68. The words tasted like ashes in his mouth. During all his years of self-imposed isolation, he told himself that someday he would go home, someday he would make things right with the family he'd abandoned. But someday had become never, and now it was too late. Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "Time bends in the circle, Mr. Maynard. What's too late in one moment might not be too late in another." "You can't bring back the dead," Clint protested. "Even this place has limits, can't it?" Sarah gestured toward the assembled spirits. "We're all dead, Mr. Maynard. Death isn't the end of existence, it's just a change in the rules. Your sister may have crossed over, but love doesn't die just because the body does. And promises don't expire just because time runs out." A new figure materialized at the edge of the circle, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. She wore a simple dress and cardigan that spoke of quiet dignity rather than fashion. The moment Clint saw her face, his knees nearly buckled. "Hello, Clint," Martha said, her voice carrying the same gentle authority he remembered from childhood. "I've been waiting for you to come home, Martha." His voice cracked like a teenager's. "But you're dead, yes. 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days ago." She smiled, and it was the same smile that had comforted him through childhood nightmares and adolescent heartbreaks. "But some conversations are too important to let death get in the way." She approached slowly, and Clint found himself moving toward her, as if pulled by invisible strings. This close, he could see that she wasn't entirely solid. There was that translucent quality that marked all the spirits in the circle. But her presence was undeniably real, undeniably Martha. "I was so angry with you," she said, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that felt like cool mist. "For years, I was angry that you chose pride over family, that you let the war take you away from us even after you came home. But anger is exhausting, little brother. Eventually it just turns into sadness." "I couldn't come back," Clint said, tears he'd held back for decades finally breaking free. "I couldn't let you see what I'd become, what the war had made me. What had it made you?" Martha asked. "A man who was hurting, a man who needed help, a man who was so afraid of being a burden that he became one anyway by staying away." The words were like surgical instruments, precise and cutting. Clint had spent 13 years convincing himself that his isolation was noble, that he was protecting his family from his darkness. But Martha's presence in the circle forced him to confront a more uncomfortable truth. He'd been protecting himself from their love, afraid that it wouldn't be enough to heal wounds that felt too deep for any medicine. "I killed people, Martha. Children sometimes when the fighting got confused. I did things that you were ordered to do by men who sent you to fight a war they didn't understand," Martha interrupted. "You think you're the first soldier to come home carrying blood on his hands? You think Dad didn't have nightmares about the Pacific? You think Grandpa Charlie didn't see horrors at Little Bighorn?" The mention of their ancestor made Clint look up sharply. "You knew about Charlie?" Martha nodded. "I did the family research you were never interested in. Charlie Maynard wasn't just a cavalry trooper. He was a man who spent 3 years after the Civil War trying to drink away the memory of Antietam and Gettysburg. Sound familiar?" She pulled something from the folds of her dress, a leather journal bound with faded ribbon. "Charlie's diary. I found it in an estate sale in Montana, of all places. Amazing how family artifacts find their way back to where they belong." Clint took the journal with shaking hands. The leather was worn smooth by handling, and the pages were covered with entries in faded ink. As he read, a pattern emerged that made his chest tighten with recognition. Charlie Maynard had written about sleepless nights, about guilt over surviving battles that claimed better men, about the temptation to disappear into the wilderness rather than burden his family with his darkness. June 3rd, 1875. The dreams came again last night. Billy Morrison's face, right before the shell took him at Antietam. He was just a boy, barely 18, and he called for his mother at the end. I should have stayed with him, should have held his hand, instead of moving on to the next wounded man. Some burdens are too heavy for one soul to carry, but carry them we must. June 15th, 1875. Martha writes from back east, asking when I'm coming home. How do I tell her that home is a place I don't deserve anymore? How do I explain that the war follows a man wherever he goes? That distance doesn't heal what guilt has broken. He never sent the letters, Martha said quietly. There are dozens of them in the back of the journal. Letters he wrote to family, but never mailed. Just like you stopped writing to us after the first year. Clint flipped to the back of the journal and found them. Pages and pages of correspondence addressed to family members he'd never heard of. Expressing love and longing, but also fear and shame. Charlie had been trapped in the same cycle of guilt and isolation that had claimed Clint decades later. What happened to him? Clint asked. He joined the cavalry and rode west, looking for something clean and purposeful to die for. Found it at Little Bighorn, alongside Thomas Whitmore and all the other men who were running from ghosts they couldn't leave behind. The pattern was becoming clear. Charlie's undelivered letters, his promise to Thomas about Sarah, his death on a Montana battlefield, all of it connected to this moment, to this circle, to the possibility of breaking cycles that had repeated for generations. The circle brought me here, Clint said slowly, understanding dawning like sunrise. Not just to deliver other people's messages, but to receive one myself, Martha nodded. Love finds a way, little brother. Even across death, even across decades of silence. I forgave you long before I died, but you needed to forgive yourself. That's what this is really about, not just keeping promises to others, but keeping the promise you made to yourself to come home. She gestured to Charlie's journal. He's here too, you know, waiting in the circle with the rest of us, ready to complete his own unfinished business. As if summoned by her words, another figure materialized, a young man in cavalry blue, bearing the same facial features that marked him as family. Charlie Maynard stepped forward with the bearing of a professional soldier, but his eyes held the same haunted quality that Clint recognized from his own mirror. Great-great-grandson, Charlie said with a formal nod. I believe we have some family business to finish. Charlie Maynard stood with the bearing of a career soldier, but his eyes held the same hollow look that Clint had seen in his own reflection during the darkest years. This was a man who had carried the weight of survival beyond its breaking point, who had sought death in service rather than healing in life. You look like hell. Boy, Charlie said with the blunt honesty of a man who had nothing left to lose. Though I suppose I looked the same when I was running from ghosts. Running seems to be a family trait, Clint replied, surprised by the bitter humor in his own voice. Dying for other people's causes is another one, Charlie observed. The Maynards have a long history of volunteer heroism and subsequent self-destruction. Time to break that pattern. Martha moved between them, her presence creating a bridge across more than a century of separation. Show him the rest of the journal, Clint, the part about the stone circle. Clint flipped through Charlie's diary until he found entries from the weeks before Little Bighorn. The handwriting grew increasingly erratic, as if written by someone fighting inner demons with every word. June 20th, 1876. The Lakota Scouts speak of a sacred place in the high country, a circle of stones where time moves like water instead of wind. They say a man can speak to the spirits of his ancestors there, can find healing for wounds that won't close with ordinary medicine. If we survive the coming battle, I mean to find this place. June 22nd, 1876. Thomas Whitmore has been having dreams about the stone circle. Says he sees it clear as day. Tall stones arranged by ancient hands, a place where promises can be kept even after death. He made me swear that if something happens to him, I'll look after his sister Sarah. Strange thing to ask, since we both know the odds of coming home. June 24th, 1876. Tomorrow, we ride with Custer. The scouts say there are more hostiles than expected, but the colonel won't hear talk of retreat. Thomas gave me something today, a compass he's been working on, carved with symbols he learned from a Lakota prisoner. Says it will point toward the sacred circle if anything happens to us. Strange boy, but good soldier. I pray we both live to see home again. Clint looked up from the journal to find Charlie watching him intently. You felt it too, didn't you? That pull toward the high country after you got back from your war? The mountains calling you to something you couldn't name. I thought I was just running away, Clint admitted. You were running toward, Charlie corrected. toward this circle, toward this moment. The stone circle has been calling Maynards for generations, waiting for one with the strength to break the cycle. Sarah Whitmore stepped forward, her form more solid now than it had been at any point since Clint's arrival. The circle was already ancient when my people first found it. The Lakota say it was built by the first humans to understand that love transcends death, that some promises echo across time until they find someone strong enough to fulfill them. Around them, the assembled spirits had grown in number. Clint counted at least 50 now, soldiers from different wars, civilians who had died with words unspoken, children who had never had the chance to say goodbye to their parents, all waiting for someone to complete the work that death had interrupted. Colonel Brennan approached, carrying something wrapped in oilcloth. "There's more to this than just delivering messages, son. The circle has been gathering power for more than a century, storing the energy of unfulfilled love until someone could focus it properly." He unwrapped the bundle to reveal an ornate military medal, the Congressional Medal of Honor, but not any version Clint had ever seen. This one was older, more elaborate, with engravings that seemed to shift in the evening light. "The circle's heart," Brennan explained. "Forged by the same hands that placed these stones, blessed by every culture that has understood the sacred nature of this place. It's not just a medal, it's a focus for the circle's power, a way to amplify the effects of fulfilled promises." "What kind of effects?" Clint asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Healing," Martha said simply. "Not just for the spirits trapped here, but for the living who carry wounds that ordinary medicine can't touch. The circle's power, properly focused, can reach across time and space to heal hearts that have been broken by war, by loss, by the weight of carrying guilt that was never theirs to bear." She gestured to the assembled spirits. "Every one of these souls has been waiting for someone who understands that true heroism isn't about dying for others. It's about living for them, about completing the work that death interrupted, about refusing to let love be defeated by time." Clint felt the weight of their collective hope pressing against him like a physical force. "But there are so many promises in the book. How can one person possibly fulfill them all?" "Not one person," Charlie said. "One family. The circle's power doesn't work alone. It requires bloodline connection, genetic memory that links past and present. That's why it called you here, why it preserved Thomas Whitmore until a Maynard could claim his body." Thomas Whitmore materialized beside Sarah, his young face bearing the same peaceful expression Clint had seen floating in the creek. "The circle showed me the future, Mr. Maynard. Not just your future, but the future of everyone touched by the promises we carry. There's a network of love and obligation that spans generations, waiting for someone with the power to activate it." "Show him," Sarah said. The air around the circle shimmered, and suddenly Clint could see threads of light connecting each spirit to distant places, distant people. Some threads were golden and strong, others faded to near invisibility. Each represented a promise made, a connection forged between souls that distance and death had strained but not broken. "Every fulfilled promise strengthens the network," Thomas explained. "Every completed obligation sends healing energy through the connections. Deliver enough messages, keep enough promises, and the circle's power becomes self-sustaining. Love begins to heal itself." Clint saw the pattern now, a vast web of human connection that had been damaged by war, by death, by the simple inability of mortals to complete what they had started. But the damage could be repaired, one promise at a time, by someone with the courage to step outside normal time and space. "What about my own guilt?" he asked. "What about the things I did in Vietnam that can't be undone?" Charlie's expression softened. "You think you're the first soldier to kill in war? You think that makes you irredeemable? Boy, I've got blood on my hands from 3 different conflicts. The trick isn't to forget what you've done. It's to balance the scales by doing more good than harm." "The circle offers absolution," Martha added, "but only to those willing to work for it. Keep these promises, heal these connections, and your own sins become part of a larger pattern of redemption." Lieutenant Patricia Hayes, The Vietnam nurse stepped forward with something in her hands, a small silver locket. This belonged to the boy I promised to write to his mother about. His name was David Chen, 19 years old, from San Francisco. He died holding this locket, asking me to make sure his mother knew he was thinking of her at the end. She pressed the locket into Clint's hands. It was warm to the touch, as if it had absorbed some essential quality from the boy who had died clutching it. His mother is still alive, Mr. Maynard, 93 years old and living in a care facility in Oakland. She's been waiting 54 years to know her son's final thoughts. How many more are there? Clint asked, though he already knew the answer would overwhelm him. Dozens, Colonel Brennan replied. But each completed promise makes the next one easier. The circle's power grows with use, and eventually, the network becomes strong enough to operate without constant intervention. Sarah moved to the altar at the center of the circle and placed her hands on the Book of Promises. There's something else you need to understand, Mr. Maynard. This isn't just about the past, it's about the future. Every generation produces its own crop of unfulfilled promises, its own burden of unfinished business. Someone needs to tend the circle, to ensure that love finds its way across time and distance. You're asking me to become some kind of guardian, Clint said. I'm asking you to become what you've always been, Martha replied. A man who understands duty, who knows the cost of leaving things undone. The difference is, this time you have the power to actually complete what you start, Boone, who had been sitting quietly throughout this supernatural conference, suddenly stood and walked to the edge of the circle. His behavior was alert, but not alarmed, the posture of a dog who had detected something familiar approaching. In the distance, Clint could hear the sound of footsteps on the mountain trail. Someone's coming, he said. Charlie nodded grimly. The circle's power doesn't go unnoticed. There are others who know about this place, who would use its abilities for purposes that have nothing to do with healing. What kind of others? Clint asked, though the way Charlie's hand moved instinctively toward where his sidearm would have hung told him everything he needed to know. The kind who think power should be hoarded instead of shared, Martha said. The kind who would turn this sacred place into a tool for personal gain. The footsteps were getting closer now, accompanied by voices that carried the flat authority of men accustomed to being obeyed. Clint counted at least 3 distinct speakers, possibly more. Their approach was methodical, professional, not the casual pace of hikers, but the measured advance of people who knew exactly where they were going and why. How long do we have? Clint asked. Long enough to prepare, Sarah replied, but not long enough to complete all the promises. You'll have to choose, save yourself and leave this work unfinished, or stay and risk everything to heal what can be healed. Clint looked around the circle at the assembled spirits, at generations of unfulfilled love, waiting for someone brave enough to make it whole. Then he looked at Boone, whose steady gaze reminded him that some loyalties transcended self-preservation. How do we fight them? He asked. Charlie smiled, and for the first time since materializing, he looked like a soldier ready for battle rather than a man haunted by ghosts. The same way Maynards have always fought, with everything we've got and no thought of retreat. The voices grew closer, and Clint could now make out specific words carried on the mountain wind. Military terminology, coordinates, tactical assessments delivered in the crisp cadence of professional soldiers. These weren't treasure hunters or curious hikers. They were operators, the kind of men who turned sacred places into strategic assets. 3 vehicles parked at the trailhead, one voice reported. No signs of recent civilian activity. Target should be isolated. Copy that, Alpha. Bravo team, what's your position on the eastern approach? Clint felt his old military training kick in automatically, cataloging threats and calculating defensive positions. The stone circle sat in a natural amphitheater with limited approaches, which could work for or against them, depending on numbers and equipment. Against trained soldiers with modern weapons, his hunting rifle and 13 years of mountain living might not be enough. How many? Charlie asked, moving to Clint's side with the fluid economy of motion that marked experienced infantry. At least 6, possibly more. They're coordinating multiple approach routes. Clint checked his rifle, ensuring the bolt worked smoothly. You were a soldier, Charlie. Any advice for fighting ghosts alongside the living? Same principles apply, Charlie replied grimly. High ground, cover, and make every shot count. The difference is, we've got advantages they don't expect. Sarah Whitmore moved to the center of the circle, her hands extended toward the ancient stones. The circle protects those who serve its purpose. It won't make you invulnerable, but it will strengthen your resolve and sharpen your aim. As if responding to her words, the standing stones began to emit a soft, phosphorescent glow, like moonlight concentrated into solid matter. The assembled spirits grew more substantial, their translucent forms gaining weight and presence. Even Boone seemed affected, his golden coat shimmering with an inner light that spoke of loyalty rewarded with power. Contact front, came a sharp call from the darkness beyond the circle. Single individual armed with what appears to be a large dog. No other movement visible. Clint positioned himself behind one of the larger standing stones, using its bulk for cover, while maintaining a clear field of fire down the main approach. The stone felt warm against his back, radiating energy that steadied his hands and cleared his mind of everything except the immediate tactical situation. Mr. Maynard, a new voice called from the tree line, cultured and confident. My name is Director Harrison, Central Intelligence Agency. We're here to discuss a matter of national security. Somehow I doubt that, Clint called back. The CIA doesn't usually travel in tactical teams to archaeological sites. A laugh echoed across the valley. Fair point. Let's say we represent interests that understand the strategic value of what you've discovered here. This site has been classified as a potential asset since satellite reconnaissance detected unusual electromagnetic signatures 6 months ago. It's a sacred place, Clint replied. Not a weapon. Everything is a weapon if you understand how to use it properly. Harrison's voice was getting closer, though Clint still couldn't pinpoint his exact location. We know you've been experimenting with the Circle's capabilities. Our psychics detected significant temporal disturbances originating from this location. We're prepared to offer you compensation for your cooperation. The mention of psychics sent a chill down Clint's spine. If they had people who could detect the Circle's activities, then his mission to fulfill the remaining promises was already compromised. These weren't just soldiers, they were specialists trained to weaponize the supernatural. What kind of cooperation? Clint asked, buying time while scanning for movement in the shadows, access to the site for controlled experiments, documentation of the Circle's capabilities, training exercises to determine its potential for intelligence gathering and covert operations. Harrison's tone suggested he was used to having his reasonable requests accepted without question. And if I refuse? Then we take the site anyway, and you become a security risk that needs to be managed. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness. But Clint had heard that tone before in military briefings, where uncomfortable decisions were presented as operational necessities. These men would kill him if he refused to cooperate, then turn the stone circle into another tool for causes that had nothing to do with healing or love. Counteroffer, Clint called back. You leave now, and I don't have to explain to my ancestors why I let government spooks desecrate their sacred ground. Your ancestors. Harrison's voice carried genuine interest now. You've made contact with deceased individuals? Fascinating. Our research suggested that might be possible, but confirmation opens entirely new operational possibilities. Movement flickered at the edge of Clint's peripheral vision, someone trying to flank around the eastern side of the circle. He adjusted his position slightly, keeping the rifle ready while maintaining his conversation with Harrison. Last chance to walk away, Clint warned. I'm afraid that's not an option. Mr. Maynard, this site is too valuable to remain in civilian hands. Alpha Team, you are clear to engage. The night erupted in violence. Muzzle flashes strobed from multiple positions as automatic weapons opened up on the stone circle. Bullets sparked off ancient rock and whined through the spaces between the standing stones. Clint rolled behind cover as chips of granite showered down around him, but something impossible was happening. The spirits weren't just observing anymore, they were fighting back. Charlie Maynard materialized beside a government shooter, his ghostly hands somehow solid enough to grapple for the man's weapon. Sarah Whitmore stood in the path of incoming bullets, her form deflecting rounds that should have passed harmlessly through her ethereal body. The stone circle itself had become a fortress, its ancient power turning defensive as the sacred space came under attack. The phosphorescent glow intensified, creating an umbrella of protection that made the attacker's night vision equipment useless while sharpening Clint's own natural senses to supernatural clarity. This wasn't just a battle for control of an archaeological site. It was a war for the soul of the circle itself, and Clint realized that everything, the promises, the spirits, the generations of unfulfilled love, hung in the balance. The battle raged with an intensity that defied the peaceful mountain setting. Modern weapons clashed against ancient power as the stone circle transformed from sacred space into supernatural fortress. Clint moved between the standing stones with fluid precision, his hunting rifle speaking in measured cadence against the staccato chatter of automatic weapons. The spirits fought beside him with increasing solidity. Charlie Maynard had somehow acquired the rifle of a fallen operative, working the bolt with the practiced efficiency of a cavalry veteran who understood that survival meant making every shot count. Thomas Whitmore and his cavalry companions formed a defensive line at the circle's eastern edge, their ghostly forms solid enough to provide cover while deflecting incoming rounds with an otherworldly resilience. "This is impossible," Harrison's voice crackled over radio communications. "The targets are exhibiting enhanced capabilities. Request immediate backup and authorization for heavy ordnance." "Negative on the ordnance," came the reply. "Asset preservation is priority one. Adapt and overcome with conventional weapons." Clint smiled grimly as he lined up another shot. Even the CIA wasn't willing to risk destroying what they'd come to steal. That limitation gave the defenders a crucial advantage. The attackers had to capture, not destroy. But the advantage was temporary. More vehicles were approaching up the mountain road, their engines echoing off canyon walls. Harrison had called for reinforcements, and Clint's ammunition was running low. Worse, he could see government snipers taking positions on the surrounding ridgelines, their night scopes glinting in the circle's phosphorescent glow. "We can't hold them much longer," Charlie observed, ejecting an empty magazine and somehow producing another from his spectral equipment. "They've got us surrounded, and more coming." Sarah Whitmore stood at the center of the circle, her hands pressed against the altar stone as streams of energy flowed between her and the ancient monument. "The circle's power is building," she called over the gunfire. "But it needs focus, needs someone to channel it properly." She gestured toward the circle's heart, the ornate medal that Colonel Brennan had placed on the altar. The artifact pulsed with its own inner light, synchronized with the rhythm of the standing stones. "Clint, you have to complete the circuit. The medal isn't just a focus, it's a key. Use it to unlock the circle's full potential." "What about the promises?" Clint asked, ducking as another burst of automatic fire chewed chunks from the stone above his head. "All those messages that need delivering?" "The circle will remember," Thomas Whitmore replied, his young face serene despite the chaos around them. "Complete the circuit, and the network becomes self-sustaining. Love will find its own way home," Clint understood. The stone circle wasn't just a tool for delivering individual messages, it was a nexus point where human connection could be amplified and focused across time and space. With enough power, it could heal the broken connections automatically, sending comfort and closure to every unfulfilled promise in its network. But reaching the altar meant crossing 20 feet of open ground under direct fire from multiple positions. It was a suicide run that would make him a perfect target for every sniper on the ridgelines. "I'll cover you," Charlie said. But Clint shook his head. "This isn't your fight anymore, great-great-grandfather. You've done your part." "Family fights together," Charlie replied firmly. "Always has, always will." The assembled spirits formed up around them, generations of Maynards and their companions, soldiers from different wars, united by the common cause of protecting something sacred from those who would corrupt it. Martha stepped forward, her presence bringing a moment of calm to the chaos. "Remember what I told you about forgiveness," she said, reaching out to touch his face with fingers that felt like cool mountain air. "This isn't about dying heroically. It's about living purposefully. Complete the circuit, little brother." "Finish what we started." Clint nodded, checking his rifle one last time. 6 rounds left in the magazine, maybe 2 more in his pocket. Enough for covering fire, but not enough for a prolonged engagement. He would have to trust that the circle's power would protect him during the final dash to the altar. "On my mark," he called to the spirits. "Give me everything you've got." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every ghost in the circle erupted into action, their forms blazing with supernatural energy as they provided covering fire, created distractions, and generally made life miserable for the government operatives trying to storm their position. Charlie and his cavalry comrades charged directly into the enemy lines, their spectral sabers somehow solid enough to disarm and disorient the attackers. Clint sprinted for the altar, zigzagging between the standing stones as bullets whined past his ears. A sniper's round sparked off the stone inches from his head. Another tugged at his sleeve without finding flesh. The circle's protective energy surrounded him like armor made of starlight and determination. He reached the altar and grasped the circle's heart with both hands. The moment his fingers touched the ancient metal, the world exploded into light. Energy flowed through him like electricity made of pure love, connecting him to every unfulfilled promise in the circle's network. He could feel Maria Rodriguez in San Antonio, finally at peace with her husband's memory. He could sense David Chen's mother in Oakland, waiting for news that was already racing toward her across the ethereal pathways. But most of all, he could feel the circle's true power awakening, not as a weapon, but as a healing force that would reach across time and space to mend what war and death had broken. The government operatives fell back, their weapons suddenly useless against power that transcended the physical world. Harrison's voice crackled over the radio one last time. "Asset is compromised. Recommend immediate withdrawal." As the tactical teams retreated down the mountain, Clint stood in the center of the stone circle, the circle's heart pulsing with gentle warmth in his hands. Around him, the spirits began to fade, not disappearing, but transforming into something lighter, freer, their earthly obligations finally fulfilled. The promises would find their way home now. Love would complete its journey across the years, and Clint Maynard, the last guardian of an ancient trust, would ensure that the circle's power remained forever beyond the reach of those who would use it for anything less than healing. Dawn broke over the stone circle like a benediction, painting the ancient monuments in shades of gold and rose that spoke of new beginnings rather than endings. The supernatural battle had left no physical scars on the landscape, no bullet holes in the stones, no evidence that modern weapons had clashed with ancient power. The circle had absorbed the violence and transformed it into something else, something healing. Clint sat on the altar stone, the circle's heart resting quietly in his palms. The artifact no longer pulsed with urgent energy. Instead, it radiated a steady warmth that spoke of work completed and balance restored. Around him, the last of the spirits were fading into morning light, their earthly obligations finally fulfilled. Charlie Maynard approached, his form already translucent in the growing daylight. "It's finished, boy. The network is active. The connections are healing themselves. Love is finding its way home. What happens now?" Clint asked. "What happens to all of you?" Martha smiled, her presence a gentle comfort that had bridged more than a century of separation. "We move on to whatever comes next. The circle held us here until someone could complete what we started. But now we're free to rest." She gestured to the fading spirits around them. "Sarah will find her peace knowing that her brother's sacrifice meant something. The soldiers can lay down their burdens, knowing their final messages reached their destinations." And you, little brother, can stop running from ghosts that were never really chasing you. Sarah Whitmore was the last to approach, her young face radiant with joy. In her hands, she carried something that made Clint's breath catch, a photograph that hadn't existed moments before. It showed a family gathering. Several generations posed around a Christmas tree with faces that bore unmistakable resemblances to both Sarah and Thomas. The network works in mysterious ways, she explained. Time bent back on itself, and somehow Charlie's promise got kept after all. A distant cousin found our family records, traced our genealogy, learned our story. Thomas and I aren't forgotten anymore. We're part of a family history that spans generations. She pressed the photograph into Clint's hands. That's what this was really about. Not just individual promises, but the connections that bind families across time. Love doesn't die with the body, it just waits for someone brave enough to help it find its way home. As the spirits faded into the morning light, Clint found himself alone in the circle with Boone. The golden retriever sat at his feet, tail wagging gently, brown eyes bright with the contentment that came from a job well done. Somehow, Boone had understood from the beginning what Clint was only now beginning to grasp, that home wasn't a place you ran from, but a truth you carried with you. The walk back to the cabin was accomplished in comfortable silence. The mountain paths seemed different now, less like escape routes and more like connections to a larger world. Clint could feel the network humming quietly in the background of his thoughts, thousands of fulfilled promises, creating ripples of healing that would spread across continents and decades. At the cabin, he found evidence of the circle's power in unexpected places. His old military footlocker, which he hadn't opened in years, now contained letters he didn't remember receiving. Thank you notes from families he'd never met, expressing gratitude for comfort received in their darkest hours. The network had been working retroactively, healing connections that existed outside normal time and space. Among the letters was one that made his hands tremble. It was addressed in Martha's familiar handwriting, but the postmark was from last week. He opened it with reverence, finding words that bridged the gap between supernatural encounter and everyday miracle. Dear Clint, if you're reading this, then you found your way to the circle and completed the work we started. I want you to know that I never stopped believing you would come home eventually. Love has a way of finding its path, even when we think we've lost it forever. The family you think you abandoned never forgot you. Your nephew David, Martha's son, has been looking for you for 15 years. He's a doctor now, working with veterans who carry the same burdens you've carried. He understands about guilt and healing, about the long journey from war to peace. His address is enclosed. He's expecting you. Welcome home, little brother. Martha, the address was in Denver, less than a day's drive from the mountain valley that had been Clint's refuge for 13 years. David Maynard, MD, Veterans Mental Health Services, a nephew he'd never met, working with soldiers who needed the kind of healing that Clint was only now beginning to understand. Clint looked around the cabin that had been his world for so long. It still felt like home, but not like a hiding place anymore. The mountains would always be here when he needed them, but they no longer represented escape from the world. They represented preparation for returning to it. He began packing methodically, taking only what he truly needed. The spirit compass, the book of promises, Charlie's diary, and the circle's heart, artifacts that connected him to a heritage of service that transcended individual wars. Boone watched from the doorway, tail wagging, with the anticipation of new adventures. The truck started on the first try, despite 13 years of minimal use. As they drove down the mountain road, Clint caught glimpses of the stone circle in his rearview mirror, its ancient stones catching the morning light like beacons. The circle would remain, he knew, waiting for the next person who needed to understand that some promises transcend death, that love finds a way across any distance, and that coming home is always possible for those brave enough to try. At the trading post in Cedar Falls, Jed Morrison looked up from his newspaper with the expression of a man seeing a ghost. Clint? Good Lord, boy, where you headed? Haven't seen you come down the mountain with more than a day pack in over a decade. Going home, Jed, Clint replied, surprising himself with how easily the words came. Took me a while to remember where that was, but I think I've got it figured out now. Jed nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Family. Family, Clint confirmed, as they drove east toward Denver, toward a nephew who understood about healing, toward a future that finally felt possible. Clint realized that the Circle's greatest gift hadn't been the power to deliver messages across time. It had been the reminder that he was part of something larger than his own guilt, part of a network of love and obligation that connected him to both the living and the dead. The promises had found their way home. Now it was time for him to do the same.